Hi, I'm Thomas, the Accidental DM, and today we're going to finish our discussion on magic in the new 2d20 version of Achtung, Cthulhu by Modiphius. If you didn't see the first part, check down in the description down below, and you'll be able to find a link to go and look at that video. But now let's kind of jump right into it, and let's finish it up. One of the first things I do want to make mention of is a couple of clarifications in terms of what I talked about in the previous video about the dabbler in magic. One of the things I was going to talk a little bit later on when I talked about the character creation, which would be in a separate video, was that the dabbler is not chosen during character creation. Only the researcher or the traditional school of magic users are going to be chosen at that time. Dabblers, as I said, are ones that just kind of find the mythos and kind of stumble upon it. And so that's not something that's chosen, just kind of something that happens to you. So it really is then kind of created in the moment to be able to use these kind of strange elements of the mythos that they are able to find. And one of the things that as a part of that is you do have then this the power rating that's associated with the dabbler. And the other thing I want to make clarified on is in terms of your choice of 1 to 3 and how that happens is that at the beginning of the casting of the spell, the magic user who's a dabbler decides then at that point how much they want to kind of push their ability to kind of be able to cast the spell. Now, as you do that, that's going to kind of increase. So you do have then that power rating of 1, but can be increased up to a power rating of 3 at that particular moment. But remember, as I said before, each effect that you roll does lead to the potential of more problems happening because of that. So there's a bit of a trade-off. You might be able to get some extra the power when you're casting the spell, but that might cause then some other problems too. Now, this is in addition to the bonuses that are gained based upon the dabbler's will rating. The other thing to kind of make mention of is that in terms of the number of spells that they have access to, dabblers, because of their initial kind of starting power rating of 1, have a little bit of a choice. Now, originally, as soon as they learn a spell, it's going to be a flawed version of the spell. But there is the capability, the possibility of that being perfected in some way, kind of continued study and how that happens. In the text on page 140, it does specifically say, a dabbler may seek to study any flawed spell that they know, refining their knowledge through practice, removing its flawed status. However, they must have cast the spell successfully at least once in-game before they can do this. Now, I've kind of tried to dig a little bit deeper into the text to see if I can find how that works. The closest thing I can come up to where this happens is during, in the character creation section, the chapter on characters, there is kind of how a character kind of advances, and there is a section in there on retraining, and I'm wondering if that's a possibly then where that kind of element comes into play. But one of the things that's absolutely necessary, as it says here in the text right here, is it must have been cast successfully at least once in-game before any of that can kind of happen. Now, once you then have a perfected kind of spell, no longer is flawed, then you can either choose to have 1 unflawed spell, 1 perfected spell, or 2 flawed spells when you're preparing your spells in your mantle for battlefield magic. The final clarification that I want to make, and this was a complete error on my part, I kind of just simply misread what was into the text itself, but when it comes to flawed spells, remember I said that a flawed spell has its own specific elements when someone who is casting it flawed would have it there, and then there was a listing then of some of the other options, as I said in the text before. The clarification I want to make is that it's not really options. These are things that do happen whenever there is a flawed spell. Again, it makes it because a dabbler casting a flawed spell is a very dangerous thing. And so whenever they cast a flawed spell, all 3 of the things that are listed in the sidebar for flawed spells happen. So you automatically suffer 1 complication in addition to any generated specifically by the spell skill test. You can only purchase additional d20s through threat, and momentum spends that are normally a part of a non-flawed spell are not applicable in this case because it is a flawed spell. So now that we've got those clarifications out of the way, let's continue our discussion about battlefield magic, and in particular, how is it then that we're going to be able to fight against it? Now, specifically in the text, we do hear a couple of ways that this can happen. One of them is resistance, and in the spell description, it'll talk specifically whether or not you're capable then of resisting the spell, and that's going to be set up through a skill test based upon a skill and an attribute. Just as any other test is, the difficulty is going to be set to the power level then of the spell itself. So it's very similar to what the caster is going to have to do, but the target then has an ability to kind of save against it. The other way that you can fight against a spell is with a counter spell. And all spellcasters, regardless of your type, have the ability to have a reaction in order to attempt to do this. Now, the one thing that's in the text that says when this can happen is that the spellcaster who's trying to counterspell must be able to see the caster attempting to cast the spell. So if you're behind something and you're not able to see what's happening, you can't do that. You literally have to be able to see the spellcaster attempting to cast the spell before you can do this. And when you make this declaration, you make this reaction, you roll then your challenge dice based upon all the other factors that are normally a part of it. And for each effect that's rolled, that increases the difficulty for the initial spellcaster by 1. So it doesn't just completely wipe it out, it just makes it a lot more difficult for them to be able to do. Now, one of the things I couldn't find in the text, which was found in the Quick Starter, is that in the Quick Starter it says that when a person uses a counter spell, the caster then loses their turn in the next round. Now, that's not in the player's guide, but that was something in the Quick Starter. I don't know if that's going to kind of get a little bit clarified a little bit later on in the final version of the text, but I couldn't find it then in the current version of the PDF that's available currently. Let's turn our attention now to the various types of spells, and I put a list then of the various headings of the different types of spells, as well as the ones that are available in the player's guide that go into each of those categories. Now, the first one is attack, and attack I think is fairly self-explanatory, and probably the one that most people are going to be using if they're going to be a spellcaster in Achtung Cthulhu. The next one is banishment. It works very similarly in a lot of ways to attack spells. However, they are specifically targeted towards those supernatural creatures, and so they have an increased stress damage then, either mental or physical, to supernatural beings, with a couple of other additions to it. If a injury is caused then by a banishment spell to a supernatural creature, that supernatural creature then loses its turn in the next round. Also, if it's defeated by a banishment spell, then they are banished from this mortal plane and they are sent back to where they came from. There's also then blessing spells that provide various benefits or enhancements in a lot of different ways to the characters. There's control spells that are more about ability for a caster to control a target and kind of have them do what it is that they wish them to do through the costing a mental stress to the targeted creature. There's curse spells, which are obviously going to be the exact opposite of blessed spells. There's also going to be included in the description of the spell that's there, the spell description, how to possibly break the curse of that spell. So it's not something that's permanent, but can be broken as well, and that would be listed. And then there is the Discharge Spell, which talks kind of about the limited number of uses that it would be available in the mantle before it begins the process of dissipating out of it. Just kind of moving along then, the next one that we have on our list is manifestations. And manifestations, kind of as described in the text, is about kind of changing reality and how that's kind of perceived and the physical world around them. There is divination, which is kind of a way of obtaining information in a couple of different versions, whether it's through the psychic way or through a runic way. There's summoning, very much I think as it's kind of described by its title, but it is about calling objects, creatures, or other phenomenon into being. There's transmutation, which is kind of about the change in a physical shape, and it also mentions in there as well as changing of one's persona. As well as physical changes. The final one is going to be a ward, which creates kind of a protection, a restoration, or a protective barrier that causes stress then to those that are not protected by that specific barrier that existed. All right, and that brings to a close then our discussion on battlefield magic. So let's turn then to that more complex, more precise version of magic known as ritualistic magic in Achtung Cthulhu. It's going to be magic then that's going to be based upon rituals, and so it's going to be about precision, it's going to be about concentration. Now, this is a type of magic, this ritual magic, that can be done by anyone. However, being a magic user in the traditional sense or in the researcher sense is going to make things a little bit easier because they're going to have more opportunities to have higher challenge dice as they kind of break down the various tests that are a part then of a ritualistic magic. Now, anyone who's not a normal magic user can still try and attempt to do magic and can even assist in magic. It just, they're not going to be as proficient proficient as someone who's more attuned to this type of thing. Now, mechanically, it's like an extended test with various tests that are going to be laid out then, with various steps that are laid out then in the spell description and how that works. So it's also going to be very similar then to the anatomy of a battlefield magic spell. You have the various components and what kind of all of those mean. So you have the requirements of it. You have the test itself, the various tests, the stress track, resistance, the various steps, the costs and the effects, what happens, and all those sorts of things. So very similar to what we saw previously on battlefield magic. Now, one of the things that's going to be helpful then to a ritualistic caster is the ability to be assisted. Now, assistants are going to make the exact same skill test then as the primary caster. And what happens then when they get a success, if there's one or more success, then they're able to use half of their power rating rounded up. And that gets added then to the primary caster. So when they're going to be making then their challenge dice rolls when they make their challenge dice rolls on the stress track for that particular thing. The number of assistants then that can attempt and help out the primary caster will be based upon the primary caster's tactic rank, which you'll be able to find then on the character's sheet. Upon completion of the ritual, the base power from the caster with any bonus power only from the assistants who actually succeed in the last step. So it's not, those things aren't cumulative and adding up. It has to do with the success rolled on the very last one. Those are the ones then that get part of the efficacy of the particular spell that's being cast. The other benefit then to using various assistants in the ritual is the ability to kind of spread out the cost of the ritual itself. Now, half of that rounded up must go to the primary caster, but the rest can kind of be divvied up amongst the various assistants who are helping. So if you've got one who has a higher stress, they might be able to take a little bit more than someone who has not quite as much stress available at that particular time. Moving on then to the idea of sacrifices as part of a ritual. Now sacrifices then kind of increase then the power as the ritual is happening and gives you benefits of that. And so there's three different levels, three different layers then of types of sacrifice that can be offered during a ritual spell. The first and lowest level is blood, which has to be from the self. What that does is on the first cost of the ritual, instead of having mental stress deducted from you, you can have that turned into physical stress. However, any armor that you have doesn't count as resistance for that, but it's just kind of diverting it from mental stress in order to be physical stress. The benefit, however, also is that you gain one challenge dice for the duration of the ritual. Now, kind of to the next level then of types of sacrifice is animal sacrifice, and the text does say that it has to be a live animal who is slaughtered. This does require an additional test, a coordination plus survival test with a difficulty of 2. However, it can be succeeded at cost, which means you can still have it happen even if you have a failed roll, but there's going to be additional complications. The benefit of having this type of sacrifice added to it is that you gain 2 challenge dice for the duration of the ritual itself. The highest level, the highest tier then is going to be the human sacrifice, and it is, as it implies, you have to ritually sacrifice a living person as a part of the ritual itself. This requires a test, just as before, a coordination plus a survival test with a difficulty of 2, which again can succeed at cost. But I think since it's going to be a human sacrifice, any complications probably need to be at a higher level as well. But the benefits of this is you gain plus two challenge dice for the duration of the ritual. The ritual also gains the vicious effect on its target. It does generate 2 threat. It increased the costs. Plus 1 challenge dice and 1 piercing 1 effect. So it's going to cause more damage to you because of the sacrifice that you offered. Obviously, offering a human sacrifice is going to be causing more changes in the mythos. So there's going to be the personal sacrifice of the caster as well as bonus damage then that's done to the target of the spell as well. Now, because we're dealing then with ritualistic magic, which is very complicated and very much about precision, there is the possibility then of obviously miscasting then ritual magic. And part of that, how that works out mechanically, is whether it's the primary caster and the assistants, if they happen to roll some complications during the various tests, they don't have any immediate effect. However, though, those number of complications must kind of be kept a hold of or kept accounted of, because when the number of complications then equals the total number of steps required for the ritual spell, then the spell miscasts. There's a difference if the complications happen in the final test or during one of the various steps, and we'll get to that in just a minute. If it's before it's completed, the spell is out of control. The effect is similar to what was intended, but it's not going to be something that's good then for the caster. Now, if a complication occurs on the final test, the spell is not miscast, according to the text, but functions like complications in battlefield magic. Now, if a ritual is miscast, it can't be continued. So, what happens, though, if you are in the midst of casting the spell and you decide to stop it for whatever reason, or you are the object or the target, then, of one of these ritual casting spells, and you don't want the bad things to happen? How is it, then, that you're able to kind of combat some of those? Now, if you're the caster, then, you do have the ability to abandon the ritual. Now, it's not just something you can just simply do. It does require a spell test as well, based upon your will plus your resistance, and the difficulty is set at the number of steps that had been completed. So if you're almost to the end of it, it's going to be a lot harder than to safely dissipate the ritual magic that's kind of been building up as the spell is continued, as opposed to whether it's after only one step or so. Now, if you succeed, there's still then going to be some complications for the caster. If it's dissipated safely on a success, the caster does suffer one fatigue for each step that had already been completed. On a failure, however, the ritual immediately miscasts, and so you have to deal then with the consequences of what happens with that. Now, let's say, though, you are the target of the spell as opposed to the one casting it, and you want to be able to stop it. How can you disrupt the spell? Now, this is possible because spells then are very complex. They require a lot of precision. They require a lot of concentration, and so if you can somehow knock the caster off their game, you're able to kind of be able to disrupt the spell. Now, according to the text, you'll be able to make an appropriate test based upon the action that you're trying to do. However, the difficulty of that is going to be a difficulty of 2. Now, if you're successful at this, it's going to create either a complication or it's going to be able to add a truth, which will increase the difficulty of the caster +1 for each time that they're trying to do the various steps of the spell. You can also attempt to attack the caster. Not only you would be able to create normal stress onto the caster itself, possibly causing an injury, which would disrupt the spell, but again, on a successful attack, spending 2 momentum to increase the difficulty on the spellcaster as they're trying to do the various steps by +1. Now, let's say, though, the spell has been cast, you've been cursed in some way. How is it then you're able to kind of reverse that? Now, rituals, as from the text, change the world, really make major changes to the world. So the only way that can be undone then is by doing the spell again, specifically with attempting to undo what had happened, with necessary sacrifices kind of relevant then to the spell as it was being cast. Now, in the player's guide, we are given 2 specific rituals that are listed in the text itself, one of them being the Balm of Balanus. I might not be pronouncing that quite correctly, but it is a Celtic healing magic, which can either do mental or physical stress, can either heal injuries or fatigue, and you need to kind of make that decision as you're casting the spell itself. There's also Baldur's Shield, which is a runic protection magic, which is able to absorb or repel either magic, projectiles, or physical attacks. And again, it has to be decided at the time of casting which one of those specifically that you're trying to stop. Now, there are, as it says in the text, the ability to find kind of stronger variations of this particular one that can do then multiple versions of different types of protection. But when you're kind of casting it right off the bat, as it's kind of laid out in the text, it's only going to be able to make a choice of one of those. And so that kind of brings us then, I think, to an end of our discussion on magic in Achtung Cthulhu 2d20 version. One of the things, again, I stated at the initial video that I put out on magic is that this is based upon the PDF version, the current PDF version that's available, which is kind of an early release, pre-release version, so that people can kind of take a look at it. If there are changes that are going to be happening to the text, I'll make note of them a little bit later on when they become available, but this is still a pre-release version of the text, and so the final text may differ a little bit. So that brings to a close then our look at magic in the 2d20 version of Achtung Cthulhu. If you're interested in learning more about Achtung Cthulhu and how the various mechanics work, I plan to do other videos in the series. The next one I plan to do is on character creation, on how that's going to kind of work itself out. So if you're interested in learning more about Achtung Cthulhu, the 2d20 version, make sure you subscribe to this channel to learn more about it. If you have any questions or comments, please put them down in the description below. Please like and share this video, and I hope to see you next time.